Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Ann Aviles, and I'm an associate professor at the University of Delaware, and I also am co-chair of the Homes Campaign of Delaware. We welcome you today to our Delaware Right to Representation for Eviction Defense press conference. The purpose of this event is to learn more about the findings of a recent polling effort on eviction defense in Representative District 2. The goal is to learn more about the results, about why Representative District 2's support of right to representation is so important, to better understand the homelessness and eviction crisis in Delaware, and what right to representation means for Delawareans statewide. So why is this important? What we do know is that Delaware's eviction crisis is worse than other states. Our eviction filing rate is 4 times higher than the national average. Right to representation measures for renters in eviction proceedings have been enacted in 3 states and also 12 cities, and we're hoping Delaware will be next. Nationally, communities of color and women, especially Black women, disproportionately face the threat of eviction. And we know that evictions have lasting impacts on communities due to what Matthew Desmond refers to as the Scarlet E. Because when renters have an eviction on their record, the long-term economic harms of this eviction often bar them from being able to access safe and stable housing. So this issue is of critical importance to increasing housing stability for renters across the state. So we encourage our attendees to please use the chat for questions, and those will happen or will be responded to after hearing from all of our panelists. So I'm going to open it up to our first panelist, who is Carrie Casey. She is the manager of the New Castle County's Community Development and Housing Department, and Casey is going to talk to us about the eviction and homeless crisis here in Delaware. Welcome.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm really honored to be here to talk briefly about the impact of evictions on people who are experiencing homelessness in our state. Before I begin, I do want to mention, as the manager of the Division of Community Development and Housing for New Castle County, we oversee the Housing Choice Voucher Program, which is Section 8. And we have over 6,000 people on our Housing Choice Voucher Program waiting list. I say that because when we issue vouchers from our waiting list, so some folks have waited years for that voucher, because of some of the barriers that folks that are receiving our vouchers have, most specifically evictions and or any sort of judgment, they are very much challenged in finding housing because of that eviction on their record. And I can say, it's not anecdotally, it's a fact. Only about 37% of our clients that receive a voucher, this precious housing subsidy that they've waited years for, are able to lease up or find rental housing in New Castle County. So that's really stark. The biggest barrier to them is, one, the lack of affordable housing, and if they have any type of judgment or eviction on their record, it is almost impossible for them to find housing in New Castle County. So I just want to state that because it's so critically important that folks, this has such long-term ramifications of the eviction. I also, and to speak specifically, when the COVID-19 pandemic hit in March of 2020, though, I'm a government employee and, proud to work for New Castle County, many of us that are panelists today, including Dr. Gilbert White and Dan, we really became rogue advocates for people experiencing homelessness because we were being told to shelter in place. There was no place to shelter. The libraries, coffee shops, et cetera, closed. And we, a lot of work was done in the state to put folks into motels because it's the safest way to house them. And luckily, New Castle County, with some of their coronavirus relief funds, purchased the Hope Center, the former Wilmington Sheraton South. And we have, been able to house over 430, 450 people. I think we're at about 400 now, about 200 children and 200 adults at the moment. And and not to be a broken record, but and I think this also bodes to some of the point in time count numbers, which is, looking at homelessness on a given night in our state. Our homeless numbers have jumped by about 26%. It is the challenge of folks being able to access housing from where, whether it's a hotel or a shelter, to be able to find safe, decent, affordable housing in our state. Because many of those folks have had an eviction in their background, or a judgment, or some sort of major financial issue that has not only caused their homelessness, which I'd say, is probably close to 50 to 60% of the folks living at the Hope Center, but then it's perpetuated by not being able to access housing on the other end because of the fact that they have that. So anything we can do, most specifically, the right to representation. It's such a huge lifelong issue that people have to grapple with when they have that eviction or judgment on their record. Anything that we can do to help them so they don't to get into this situation, we truly believe is important. And I think even County Executive Meyer, who I work for, has said, we have the Hope Center, it's wonderful, but we as a society and a state need to do better, because the most effective way to end homelessness is to prevent it in the first place. So by giving folks the tools, by providing that legal representation to help folks navigate this absolutely complicated system is extremely important. So I hope that's somewhat of a perspective, not only with my Section 8 housing choice voucher hat on, but also, looking at the faces and the families that live at the Hope Center and listening to what they've experienced, and knowing that it's such a journey on the back end of this, and learning from that. I think it's really important that we have this in our state, and that we become, a state, one of the first states to offer right to representation. So thank you.
Thank you, Carrie, so much for sharing that very important information. Now, we're going to hear from Dr. Deborah Gilbert-White, who is a community advocate and author, and she is going to speak on how right to representation can help people facing eviction. Dr. Gilbert-White.
Thank you, Anne. Hello, I am Dr. Deborah Gilbert-White, and 10 years ago this month, I was evicted and that I'm teaching position.
I think we may be having some technical difficulties, Dr. Gilbert-White.
Was not enough, okay. But it was not enough to cover my rent and other basic needs as I searched for full-time employment. For a few months leading up to the eviction, I was making partial payments, but was consistently late. I shared with my landlord my situation. Not unlike many others today, having lost income, I was struggling to keep a roof over my head, to eat, and simply to survive. I found myself underemployed, evicted, and not having awareness of any other options that could have assisted me. I found myself caught up in a system that I had difficulty navigating, and that was not supportive in any way of people like me to keep housing. I was not trying to get over on my landlord. I had hit a rough patch, and I felt there was no one willing to hear that. I now realize that losing my full-time income, being evicted, and spending time without housing and in a women's shelter was traumatic for me. I continued to work through that trauma by sharing my experience and supporting legislation that can make a difference for people at risk of homelessness. I was evicted owing my landlord $623. My monthly rent was $599. There were too many people in the courtroom who looked like me, female and African American. From what I could assess, none of us had legal representation. And these many years later, I recognize the power imbalance that represents, and how for me, there was no one in the courtroom that day looking out for my best interests. I did not know the system, and there was no one there to assist me in navigating it. Right to representation provides people with a fighting chance to be supported when they are experiencing financial hardship that impacts the ability to pay rent and to keep housing. It provides us with a fighting chance to find a workable solution for both landlords and tenants, and is a preventive measure to experiencing homelessness. For me, the most compelling aspect connected to my eviction was its aftermath. Shortly after leaving the shelter in 2012, I paid my landlord all past rent and court fees. My judgment would not show satisfied until April 2019. And that was only as a result from calls I made to the court and to the landlord to verify information while researching my book. The landlord did not inform the court that I had paid what I owed them. I will never know how that lingering judgment impacted my employment or housing opportunities over those 7 years. I do believe that it did not help. I ask that all members of Delaware's General Assembly support right to representation, to support people at risk of losing housing, to prevent homelessness, and to support housing as a human right. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gilbert White, for sharing your story. Next up, we're going to hear from Dan Atkins. Dan Atkins is the Executive Director of the Community Legal Aid Society.
Thank you so much, Dr. Aviles. I'm really happy to be here and to speak up on behalf of this important right. Let me just provide some more context for everyone. We have a tremendous justice gap in this state and in this country, meaning there is no guaranteed right to representation in civil matters like there is in criminal matters. As a result, about 80% of the civil legal needs of poor people are going unmet. Landlord-tenant cases, eviction actions are chief among them. The asymmetry that we have occurring in Delaware is stark. What I mean by that is as follows. About 86% of the time, according to a study from the University of Delaware that looked at a random sampling of 300 eviction cases over a 3-year period, 86% of the time, landlords were represented in one fashion or another, either by a lawyer or by their property manager agent. And there's a special rule in Delaware that allows corporations, companies, landlords to be represented by non-attorneys. That's special for them. Less than 5%, actually 2% of the time in these cases were the tenants represented. This asymmetry is extremely unfortunate and it creates unnatural results. An independent study out of Harvard Law School about 10 years ago looked at 133 cases in landlord-tenant court there. And it was a randomized control study there where half the tenants were assigned a legal aid lawyer, half the tenants were assigned no lawyer, no representation at all. And they found that you were twice as likely to win your case merely if you had representation. So you can imagine that there are people being evicted today in Delaware, not because they should be, but merely because they don't have access to representation. Having representation is outcome determinative in these cases. Why? These cases are too complicated to navigate on your own. And what we see is that many tenants, about 30%, may not even show up for court because they don't believe they have a fighting chance. That needs to change. That's not justice. That's not a justice system that is working the way it's supposed to. We need to have people fighting on a level playing field. If the landlords have access to some representation because they have means, we need to provide the representation to tenants in some way. The stakes are too high. Right now, eviction cases are very cheap, quick, and easy for landlords. What I mean by that is it costs $45 filing fee. They don't need to hire a lawyer. The case can take from 6 weeks from the time that they file their complaint to the time they get a writ of possession. And there does not need to be a minimum amount in dispute, meaning you could be evicted for, as Dr. Gilbert White pointed out, far less than $1,000. You can be evicted for $1 in the state of Delaware. So for the landlords, the cost of the system is very low, but for the families that are facing eviction and for us as a community at large, the costs are extremely high. We as a community are subsidizing this system. And what I mean by that is as follows. An eviction crisis like we have today, where as Dr. Aviles noted, 4 times the eviction filing rate. Well, what that means is we have communities and families that are destabilized. That means increased use of foster care, increased use of the criminal justice system, increased healthcare costs, job instability, missed school because kids are homeless. These are costs that we are bearing as a society. We commissioned an independent study from a financial services firm out of New York called Stout. And what they found was that an investment in a right to representation would pay off at almost a rate of 3 to 1, meaning for every dollar we invest in guaranteeing a right to representation in eviction cases, there would be about $2.76 of benefit coming back to the state in terms of averted costs and other benefits. Less investment in homeless shelters, the cost of rehousing families, the missed school, the foster care, the criminal justice involvement, the missed work. These are costs that we are bearing now. So the question really is not whether we can afford to provide a right to representation. The better question is, can we afford not to? Thank you.
Thank you, Dan, so much. Wow. Okay. Sorry. Some of those numbers really kind of stuck with me. And I also just want to add, I know I'm going a little off script here, but what Dan just spoke to is the immediate effects. And I think that those long-term effects of the destabilization of families and communities are ones that we have, we have some data around that, but what happens today will continue to impact children and families for decades to come. And so I really just want to highlight that point. Thank you. So next up, we have Javon Rich. Javon Rich is the Policy and Advocacy Director for the ACLU of Delaware. Welcome, Javon.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you so much for that introduction, Anne. Like my colleagues and friends recently stated, all Delawareans, regardless of their circumstances or background, should have safe and stable housing. But we know that's not the reality. The reality is that there are disparities in who has access to safe and stable housing based on gender and race. On average, evictions are filed against Black renters at nearly twice the rate of white renters. And the disparities are worse for Black women, who are more than twice as likely to have evictions filed against them as white people. Black women even disproportionately experience eviction filings and evictions more than brown households, as well as households that are headed by Black males. So we see those, disparities in gender and race, and a bleak example of the urgent need for access to representation is Representative District 2. Residents in Representative District 2, represented by Representative Stephanie Bolden, face high rates of poverty and are among the highest eviction rates in all of Delaware. Representative District 2 is also the home of people and families and groups of people, like I just mentioned, who stand to be at most risk of evictions. According to the census reporter, 32% of people live in RD2 or Representative District 2 below the poverty line. That is more than double the rate for the entire state. Also, 66% of housing in that district is occupied by a renter. Black and brown people make up over 80% of RD2, and just under half of the households are led by women. So many people in Representative District 2 stand to be at risk for evictions, and not just evictions, evictions without representation to ensure that they can keep their home. And evictions have lasting impacts on these communities, as stated before, due to blacklisting for renters who have an eviction on their record, and there are long-term economic harms of eviction. So as in Representative District 2, by supporting the right to representation for renters facing eviction, Representative Bolden can defend women and communities of color in that district, and essentially across Delaware. As a layered advocacy campaign, the Delaware's Right to Representation for Eviction Defense sent education mailers and organized in Representative District 2 to lift up the voices of people in that district. We also conducted a poll of voters in Representative District 2 to learn where they stand on the right to representation, which you will hear about next. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Javon. Great information. And also just, again, want to highlight here that this is an issue not only of housing justice, but it's also an issue of gender and racial justice, right? Hearing those numbers and who's impacted. So next we're going to hear from Jim Williams. Jim Williams, excuse me, is from the Public Policy Polling, and is a representative from the Public Policy Polling. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you, Ann, and thank you everybody for being on the call today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the way that we conducted the poll, and then what some of the numbers say from the questions that we asked. We surveyed 100 registered voters in Delaware House District number 2 between October 27th and November 1st of this year. We weighted the data as needed for race, for age brackets, for educational attainment, and other demographics to make sure that the sample in the poll looks like the district that we are polling. And the data that we found was pretty striking and pretty clear. As Javon mentioned, it's a district where 80% of the residents are people of color, and 66% of residents rent their home. And indeed, fully 53% of renters in the district either have been evicted or they know somebody that's been evicted. As you've been hearing throughout the call, it's a problem that's prevalent in the district. We found in this district support for a statewide right to legal representation extends beyond only renters to the entire population. An overwhelming percentage of voters in the district, 71%, said that they support legislation to establish a statewide right to legal representation for renters who are facing eviction. So it's pretty clear. We asked the question in 2 different ways, and both of them, well over 2/3, said that they support a right to legal representation. That was the main takeaway from the poll. So the voters here are clear in their voice in this poll. Securing the right to representation for eviction defense is an issue that they don't want to wait on. And now it's up to lawmakers to listen to those voices.
Thank you so much, Jim. So I'd like to open it up now to any questions. You can either put them in the chat if folks have questions for any of our panelists or just for the information shared in general. We will take those at this time. If there are no questions, I don't know, any of our panelists, is there anything that you'd like to further highlight or share that maybe you thought you didn't have time to share? Okay, I do see a question here from Ray Krantz. She says, have you received any response from Representative Bolden as to her lack of support for this bill? So I don't know if that would be a question maybe for Dan or Javon.
Hi, I'll give this question a go. We know that Representative Bolden did not support moving Senate Bill 101 forward this year. However, as we've talked about, Representative Bolden does have the unique power to defend the residents in that district. And so our hope is that she uses this opportunity to stand up for constituents in her district in 2022 by supporting this legislation that would implement a statewide right to representation for renters facing eviction. So this is a unique opportunity, right? So to protect people in Representative District 2, but essentially in the entire state.
Would anybody like to add to that? Thank you for that, Javon. Nope. Okay. I believe we may have another question.
Hi, this is Andrew Galvin. Dan, you said something about 4 times the eviction rate. I didn't quite catch that. What was that statistic you were offering there?
Yeah, it was actually Dr. Aviles in her opening remarks. She mentioned a really important statistic. So it was that Delaware has an eviction filing rate 4 times the national average. So obviously there's something going on here in Delaware, and I think it's a number of factors. One is a shortage of affordable housing. Too many people are paying too much for their rent, and so that's making them vulnerable. Secondly, we have low barriers for landlords to this eviction process, meaning it's just a cost of doing business that they're going to have a churn of tenants going in and out who can't meet the rent. So, if those barriers of entry into the eviction filing system are too low, you're going to see an overuse of it. And I think that that's what we're seeing here in Delaware with an eviction filing rate 4 times the national average.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for your question as well. I believe we may have another question here in the chat. It says there was a mention of the downstream effects of this on other systems. I'm assuming eviction on other systems. Do we have hard data on how rates of foster care requests in the state of Delaware correspond with eviction filing rates? It's a good question. I don't know, Carrie, if maybe you might be able to speak to that.
I think Dan's raising his hand. I could not, but let's see what Dan.
Yeah. So the Stout report is available, publicly available. We've posted it in several different places publicly. I believe it's on our Right to Representation webpage, housed through the ACLU. And it's a pretty extensive report. And in there is the math behind that data point. The idea that an increase in eviction leads to an increased reliance on foster care. And that is based also on national data as well, where you see this phenomenon occurring. Okay. I encourage you to take a look at that Stout report.
Thank you, Dan. I would also, encourage, and maybe that's something we can also share with folks, is the Stout report, because there's a lot of good data in there for sure. Do we have other questions? Oh, I think I see another one here. What opportunities are there to use American Rescue Plan funds to slow evictions while we wait for legislators to take action in 2022? I don't know, Dan, if you can maybe speak to that.
Sure. So there are, look, some significant action has already been taken, and that is the creation of the Housing Assistance Fund. So that is a fund being administered by the Delaware State Housing Authority that allows for stimulus funds to be used to pay for rent that is owed and a little bit of future rent and other expenses as well. That's done a big part in slowing the evictions during the pandemic. This has been crucial. The problem with it is it's been underutilized here in Delaware and around the country. Landlords seem to be reluctant to engage in that process for several different reasons, we believe. One, there's some bureaucracy to it. There's some red tape. There's some demand for documents. And for whatever reason, some landlords aren't willing to hand over some documents, tax returns, etc. Secondly, there has to be a commitment not to evict the tenant if they take this money, not to evict for a period going forward, and they don't want their hands tied that way. Again, they want to be able to turn that unit over and increase the rent if they can, and they think that they're going to find tenants who are going to be able to afford the higher rent. But that housing assistance money is crucial, and we're working now, legal aid organizations are working with the housing authority to try and increase tenant and landlord engagement with the housing assistance program, and that's crucial. If we don't get more engagement, a significant amount of money is going to be returned to the federal government, because the feds gave this money to be spent, and if states are not spending it appropriately, adequately, quickly enough, they're going to take it back and give it to states that are able to fund it. So we're very motivated. The state housing authority and the legal aid organizations are very motivated to work together to try and get this money into the hands of both landlords and tenants who need it. This is crucial. The other avenue that we're working with the housing authorities to use the stimulus money, ERA money, ARPA money, to support more tenant defense work. So it is possible that some of this stimulus money could be used to fund the right to representation going forward at some level if the state chooses. Funding wasn't the problem in the last legislative session. The champions of this bill succeeded in getting money set aside to fund this for the next year at least. And but nevertheless, it is really significant to keep in mind that we can use some of this stimulus money to kickstart this right to representation, sort of a pilot model going forward. And that's really important.
And if I could add one thing too, if we look back to the CARES Act funding that was received, the jurisdictions did put at least some of our HUD, U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development CARES Act money. Newcastle County and I think Delaware State Housing Authority and I think Wilmington put funding towards, funding to pay for an attorney to do that work. So that money exists as well. So even looking before ARPA to CARES, there is money for not a ton of money, but money to fund some, staff salaries for this.
Thank you both for your input there. That's very helpful. So we have another question. Do you anticipate that right to counsel would increase the number of landlords accepting this rental assistance? And will we still have time to use these funds next year if and when this bill is passed? I don't know, Dan, if that's another question for you.
Sure. Yeah, that's great. So yes, we believe that representation can help tenants and landlords get better engaged with the housing assistance program. And in fact, we've made a proposal to the housing authority to engage community navigators. These would be folks who would be getting a list of people that are facing eviction and trying to reach out to them to engage with them and the landlords to make sure that they know about this program. There's rampant lack of awareness about the housing assistance program. It's sort of this hidden secret. And we are shocked at how few people are aware of it, particularly landlords. They could get get thousands and thousands of dollars of back rent paid. And we just want them to know about it. So we are talking with the housing authority about engaging these community navigators in this way. And so we think that that's really going to be an effective tool to help both, representation can help not just the tenants who are receiving the representation, but also the landlords. And in fact, the Stout report speaks to that and their experience with right to representation in other communities, where the landlords at first were a little apprehensive about it. Anytime they've been, sort of been advantaged by an uneven playing field, leveling that playing field can be a little frightening at first. But then the experience that Stout reports is that the landlords find that it's actually helpful. They're able to resolve cases much more quickly when the tenants are resolved. The tenants can, the lawyers or the representatives for the tenants can get deals made much better. They can get their clients to comply with compromises that are struck, and they can tell them, hey, when they have a strong case and when they have a weaker case, and that's really an important element to getting these cases resolved. The Justice of the Peace Court position on this is also supportive in the sense that they advocate for more people being represented. Courts work better when both sides are represented. This kind of unequal representation helps no one, ultimately. No one.
Thank you for that, Dan. And I don't know if you can speak to this to the second part of that question. I think it was related to your statement regarding, we have this money, but if we don't use it, then it'll be taken back. So will the funds, if we're hoping right to representation is passed, will those funds be able to be used for the following year? How will that work?
Yes, so there are many different pots of money, stimulus money. Carrie was speaking to the CARES Act funds. Then there's the Emergency Rental Assistance Funds 1, and then there's Emergency Rental Assistance Funds 2, and then there's the American Relief Act funds, the ARPA funds. They all have different end dates, and actually the ERA 2 end date is pushed back to 2025. So yes, there's going to be plenty of money coming into Delaware to support these kinds of initiatives. And we need to get ahead of this. We need to invest upfront so we can avoid these terribly traumatic costs. And when I say costs, I don't mean just financial costs. I mean human costs on the back end that Dr. Avila spoke about. The disruption to low-income communities, the disruption to Black and brown families, to female-headed households, to families that are going to see kids in foster care, adults losing jobs, kids missing school. These consequences are real, and they cost us much more in the long term if we ignore them than if we just get ahead of it and try to prevent this terrible event of an eviction, forcing a family to become homeless. If we can prevent that in the front end, we're going to be much better than trying to fix it on the back end, getting families back together.
Thank you so much, Dan. I'm just looking to see if there's any other questions. I think is there anyone else who has a question? I want to give folks an opportunity to speak. Okay, well, I think those are all of our questions. I guess we can close, and I just want to again highlight, I'm looking at some of the notes I took as people were talking, but definitely, right, again, recognizing that there is a human, right, not just financial cost to people not having representation when they go to court. We know that this is an effective tool, right, because other states and municipalities have passed a right to counsel or the right to representation. And we know that it will help to stabilize communities. And in particular, as we're talking about today, Representative District 2, where we have an overwhelming number of people that experience, right, evictions, where we have more people, right, who are experiencing economic hardships, where we have, as Javon stated, 80% of the community is Black and Brown families. And if we are serious about addressing, right, housing justice, racial justice, and gender justice, then we need to have a right to representation here in the state of Delaware. So we thank you all for your time today. And we hope that folks will continue to help us spread the word and to support a right to representation. Thank you.